On a cloudless morning on the sun-drenched runway of Miami Airport, as the roar of the engines drowned out all thought, a blatant humiliation took place. Not in the darkness, but right in broad daylight. A black mechanic, a quiet worker with calloused hands and years of experience, was publicly insulted by a powerful white female billionaire in front of everyone. Charlotte Reynolds, the heiress CEO of Reynolds Corporation, born into luxury and raised amidst hollow praise, not only rejected Marcus Johnson's offer of help, but also mocked him as a lowly man unworthy of touching her private jet. To her, the color of his skin and his grease-stained uniform were enough to define his worth. Little did she know, or care, that the man standing before her was the reason she was alive that day. And then, when disaster struck, and no one but the very man she had humiliated was capable of saving her, Charlotte was forced to face a harsh truth. The mechanic she had scorned was the son of the woman who had once saved her father's life, a debt the Reynolds family had never repaid. This time, justice would not knock on her door with words, but with action. Miami International Airport in the morning was a noisy symphony of engines, horns, and hurried footsteps. On that vast concrete expanse, among dozens of technicians in blue uniforms, there was one man no one truly saw, not because he blended into the crowd, but because society had never learned to pay attention to people like him. Marcus Johnson, a tall black man with calloused hands and a sharp gaze, stood there, as much a part of the metal structure, cables, bolts, and engines as any tool. He was a silent mechanic, but no one could deny his excellence. Marcus didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Every motion when checking an engine, every turn of a wrench, every time he listened to the strange screech of a machine, bore the mark of someone who worked not just with his hands, but with his soul. Born and raised in a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, Marcus learned valuable lessons from his single mother, Mary Ann Johnson, a diligent janitor who worked the night shift to support her son. Every morning when Marcus woke up for school, she hadn't yet returned home. And every night when he studied in the dim light, she silently prepared his lunchbox and uniform for the next day. Mary Ann had once said, "People won't easily give you a chance, but if you do well, they'll stay silent. If you do excellently, they'll have to admit it, whether they want to or not." And that was how Marcus grew up. Not begging for sympathy, not demanding recognition, just pouring all his energy into each bolt, each pressure system, each final check before a bird of steel took to the sky. For him, precision was the language of self-respect, and the trust of hundreds of passengers each day rested in those silent hands, even though no one knew his name. But no matter how excellent Marcus was, the gaze of the wealthy passengers or the high-ranking managers always slid over him as if he were part of the machinery, invisible, unthanked, and nameless. To them, Marcus was just the black mechanic with oil-stained clothes. And then, on a bright sunny morning like any other, the life of this invisible mechanic was about to be thrust into the spotlight. Not through recognition, but by a humiliation, leading to an unexpected trial by fire. And just as Marcus bent down to check the hydraulic system beneath a Boeing 737, a sharp sound from the radio strapped to his side made him pause. "Marcus Johnson, report to VIP Hangar 3 immediately. Reynolds Corporation's private jet has a critical issue." The voice of the control center came through calmly, not urgent, but enough to make those around him glance up. A few eyes turned toward Marcus, not out of curiosity, but because VIP Hangar 3 wasn't a place just anyone could enter. It was the domain of power and wealth, where billionaires, politicians, and the elite came and went in their chrome-plated jets, where marble floors were polished every hour, and employees were expected to smile just the right amount. Cold, proper, never too friendly. Marcus didn't react except for a nod. He placed his tools back in the box, locked it out of professional habit, then walked quickly toward the restricted area. He had no idea that his steps were leading him into a confrontation, not with engines or technical faults, but with a prejudice that had been smoldering for generations. VIP Hangar 3 appeared like a miniature kingdom. The entrance was guarded by security, service vehicles moved silently, and in the midst of it all stood a Gulfstream private jet, its silver body gleaming, with a simple but powerful logo, Reynolds Corporation. Just as Marcus touched the handle of the tool cart, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Stop! Who are you? Who gave you permission to approach this jet?" Stepping out from the cabin was Charlotte Reynolds, the young CEO of the corporation. Her slender figure in a perfectly tailored gray dress, her hair styled up, and her high-end heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, Charlotte didn't need to shout to make others fear her. Her gaze alone was enough to make anyone shrink. Marcus slowed his pace, keeping his voice calm. "I'm the technician assigned to handle the issue, ma'am." Charlotte squinted at him, as if scrutinizing him under a microscope. Her face showed nothing but disdain, not a hint of patience, and certainly no respect for the man standing before her. "Is there no one else? Someone actually qualified? You think I'd trust a $65 million jet to a mechanic like you?" She emphasized the last word, like a cold blade scraping across skin. Marcus stood still. His hands subtly tightened around the tool cart handle. He'd been looked down on before, ignored, called far worse names than that, but this time it was something heavier. It wasn't the words themselves, but the smug, innate attitude, as if every mistake in the world could never happen to someone like Charlotte, only to those who were poorer, darker, and beneath her. Behind Charlotte, two young assistants exchanged glances, unsure. One of them opened their mouth to speak, but Charlotte raised her hand to stop them. Her eyes locked onto Marcus as though he were a stain on the clean marble floor. "I want someone else. Get someone else here, now." Marcus kept his composure, simply replying, "I'm the on-call technician. If this is an emergency, I can fix it in 10 minutes. Charlotte laughed. A soundless laugh, just a slight curl of her lips, cold and full of scorn. 10 minutes? To ruin everything even more? Don't make me report this to the board. Her words didn't just diminish him, they denied every ounce of skill, experience, and dedication he had built over the years. But Marcus didn't protest. He just nodded, stepped back a few paces and walked away with his usual calm, but inside a silent wound was opening. The sky outside remained clear, but in the heart of the mechanic a storm was quietly brewing. Marcus returned to the break room, his shoulders weighed down, not by the work, but by that all-too-familiar feeling, the feeling of a person stripped of their dignity just because of their background, skin color, and oil-stained uniform. He had no idea that just minutes later, the solid world of Charlotte Reynolds would crack for the first time by the very man she had just scorned. Marcus walked slowly out of the maintenance area, his head slightly bowed, not out of shame, but because he was struggling to keep the anger bubbling in his chest in check. Over the years working at the airport, he had heard all sorts of voices. Indifferent, hurried, even rude, but few had unleashed such subtle and brutal contempt on him as Charlotte Reynolds. To Charlotte, power was in her very blood. She was the only daughter of Richard Reynolds, the founder of the largest airline corporation in the United States. Charlotte had never had to struggle. Every step of the way was paved with marble long before she could walk. She grew up in penthouses with private staff for every meal, graduated from an Ivy League university with grades polished by her prominent last name. In her world, everyone had a defined place, And Marcus, with his oil-stained uniform and greasy nails, was not in any class she deemed worthy of conversation. As Marcus returned with his toolbox in hand, still determined to do his job, he clearly saw the fault in the hydraulic system, a misaligned pressure hose, not serious if addressed in time. In his mind, the steps to fix it were as clear as a map. But before he could proceed, a sharp, icy voice cut through the air. "Hey, stop!" Marcus paused mid-step, but didn't turn around. He had recognized that voice. "Isn't there anyone more qualified to handle this?" Charlotte continued, each word falling on the stone floor, shattering from the obvious disdain. The atmosphere in the hangar grew heavy. A few other technicians glanced at each other, avoiding Marcus's gaze. One of Charlotte's assistants hesitated, almost stepped forward to explain, but then pulled back. Charlotte didn't need anyone to defend her point. To her, Marcus was not a person to debate. He was an unwanted presence, out of place, out of class. "I bet you've never stepped into a plane like this," she said, her cold smile as if telling a joke only she found amusing. Marcus turned to look at her, not with a challenging gaze, but with the silent look of someone who had been judged 1,000 times, but never once allowed it to make him bow his head. He replied quietly, his voice steady but not obsequious. "I'm the on-call technician, ma'am. The issue isn't serious. I can handle it in a few minutes." Charlotte scoffed, stepping a little closer, as if to force the space around her to retreat. "I don't need you to handle it. I need an expert, not someone fresh out of community trade school." This time, the silence in the hangar wasn't just awkward, it was tense, palpable. Some turned away, others looked up at Marcus with wide eyes, waiting to see what he would do. But he just nodded. No argument, no response. He turned, picked up the toolbox, and left with heavy steps. What she didn't know, and perhaps didn't want to know, was that Marcus had graduated with honors from a federal aviation engineering program, that he had been invited to teach technical courses but declined in order to continue working directly with the aircraft, because he believed that the person who truly understood engineering was the one who never stopped working with it by hand. Charlotte, in her arrogance shaped since birth, didn't see that those calloused hands had saved hundreds of flights from risk. To her, if someone didn't wear Rolex and speak with a refined East Coast accent, their skills weren't worth a dime. Marcus walked into the break room, closed the door gently. In his hand, the toolbox was still intact, but in his heart, there was a long, cold cut. He sat in the chair, quietly staring out the window. Outside, planes were taxiing and taking off, the sky a clear blue, and on the ground, a man had just been scorned not for a mistake, but simply for being who he was. He had no idea that in just a few minutes fate would call him back. Not with a phone call, but with a small explosion. One that would silence the entire hangar and force Charlotte Reynolds to face the reality she had always denied. Marcus was still sitting in the break room, his empty gaze fixed through the frosted glass window. The sky outside remained clear, without a cloud in sight, but inside him the clouds had gathered. Something in his chest felt suffocating, not because of the lingering anger, but because of that familiar sense of powerlessness, the same feeling he had experienced as a child when he saw his mother pushed aside, silenced, unheard, only ordered around like a shadow. He gently rubbed his left wrist, the spot where a small scar from the first time he misaligned a hydraulic bolt when he was new to the job. 7 years had passed, but he never forgot the lesson from that day. Just one small mistake could destroy an entire system. And now, in his mind, a strange intuition began to creep in, as if everything that had just happened was unfinished, as if something had not been handled properly, as if a fault was quietly accumulating somewhere, waiting to erupt. And then, almost to confirm that instinct. A dry, sharp sound echoed from the VIP hangar. It wasn't loud, not an explosion like an electrical burst, but it was enough to shatter the stillness in the air around him. Marcus immediately sprang to his feet. Through the small window, he saw a thin, white column of smoke rising from the left wing of the Gulfstream jet he had been about to repair. At first, it was just a light streak, but within seconds it spread, like a burning thread being blown out by the wind. Then, the alarm sirens blared, long, sharp shrieks signaling a potential fire hazard in the aircraft preparing for takeoff. The hangar fell into chaos. Technicians rushed to the emergency stations, some frantically calling the fire department. Senior staff hurriedly took off their badges to escape, while the service crew scattered like bees from a broken hive. Within less than a minute, the VIP parking area, once quiet and elegant like a gilded hall, had become a battlefield. Marcus didn't think twice. He grabbed the toolbox bolted out of the break room and ran straight for the smoking jet. No one called for him, no one gave him orders, and certainly no one had given him permission to act. But he couldn't stay still, not just for the sake of professional duty, but because there was one unbreakable principle inside him. When lives are at risk, procedures become secondary. He dashed through the long corridor connecting the tech area to the tarmac, each step feeling weightless. The wind hit his face. The blinding sunlight made his eyes sting, but Marcus only focused on one thing, the left wing area, where the hydraulic hose might have been overloaded. And just as he had predicted, at the junction between the drive system and the landing gear assembly, a small crack had caused a pressure leak. From there, the hydraulic oil pressure began tearing apart the weakest welds, creating friction and generating heat. If the jet increased power to take off, the entire system could explode or collapse the landing gear, causing a deadly accident, especially with high-profile passengers on board, including Charlotte Reynolds herself. Marcus rushed over, bent low, turned on his inspection light, donned heat-resistant gloves, and opened the toolbox. He knew he didn't have much time. Every move had to be precise, no mistakes allowed, because in this moment, every second was equivalent to a life. Then, from the direction of the aircraft stairs, a shrill voice screamed, "What are you doing there? Stop! I don't permit this." It was Charlotte. She was standing on the third step, holding her phone, yelling into the screen at some subordinate, then turning to shout at Marcus with a mix of panic and wounded pride. "Get him out of there. Call someone else. I asked for an expert." No one responded to her. Everyone was in a panic. The people she had once considered her professional team were now scattered like broken-winged birds, none of them daring to touch a system they had never worked with in real life. In their eyes, and in the eyes of everyone present, there was only one person who remained calm and knew exactly what he was doing. Marcus Johnson. Charlotte screamed again, but this time no one listened. Not because no one wanted to listen, but because everyone understood the only one capable of saving them from disaster was not her, but the very person she had just humiliated. Marcus didn't look up. He closed the pressure valve, reconnected the hose with a temporary clamp, welded the joint with a hot copper rod, and then double-checked the entire hydraulic feedback loop. His hands were drenched in sweat, his shirt covered in machine dust, his knees muddied, but each action was as precise as an unspoken melody. Behind him, Charlotte's voice continued to shout, fading into the sound of the wind and alarm sirens. "Call the lead technician. I want someone truly qualified. Don't let him touch this aircraft." Marcus, still not looking back, spoke just loud enough for the pilot to hear. "If you take off with this system, the landing gear will collapse. Pull the plane back into the hangar, right now." The pilot, a middle-aged man with hundreds of hours flying private jets, looked at Marcus, then glanced at the landing gear assembly still lightly smoking. He didn't need paperwork or confirmation to understand the seriousness. Nodding, he signaled to the crew to shut down the engines and activated the reverse towing mode to pull the aircraft back to maintenance. The entire tarmac fell silent, a strange moment where power was reversed and no one dared to object. Marcus stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, then quietly stepped back, making way for the official engineering team that was rushing toward him. One of them, who had been one of his harshest critics, looked at Marcus, then lowered his head slightly. No words, only acknowledgement. And Charlotte, she didn't scream anymore. She stood frozen, her hand gripping the stairs rail, lips tightly pressed, her eyes filled with both fury and confusion. There was something in Marcus's gaze that prevented her from leaving. Not defiance, but the silence of someone who had just done the right thing, not seeking praise, not needing to prove himself, and certainly not needing her forgiveness. It was the moment Charlotte Reynolds, for the first time, realized that not everyone who remains silent does so out of weakness. Some people choose silence because they know the truth will speak for them in the end. The silence after the command to pull the plane off the runway was like a vacuum in the midst of a hurricane. When the pilot looked back to confirm with Marcus and decisively flipped the switch to shut down the engine, no one objected. Not because they didn't have the authority, but because everyone knew, at that moment, the only power that mattered was real competence. As Marcus stood up, drenched in sweat, his hands still covered in metal dust, a few technicians from nearby areas began to gather. Some looked at him with unreadable expressions, between skepticism and admiration. Others had moved to stop him earlier, but were too late. A technician named Cole whispered, his voice full of concern, "Marcus, don't get involved any further. She just humiliated you. The whole maintenance crew heard it. If you touch that plane and something goes wrong, they'll pin it all on you." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He just glanced at Cole for a moment, then looked back toward the thin stream of smoke still rising from the landing gear. No guessing, no debating, just experience and instinct. He knew time was running out. A light breeze swept across the tarmac, carrying the smell of hot hydraulic oil, sharp and sour, the smell of danger, of things that seemed small but could kill dozens in an instant. Marcus nodded slightly, confirming his own thoughts, and bent down again. He carefully opened the pressure feedback hatch, checking the connectors. The sensation in his fingertips told him what Charlotte and her team didn't know. The connectors had been stretched beyond their safe limits, possibly due to sloppy repairs, or worse, due to overlooking pressure buildup in recent maintenance cycles. Every technical specification has a tolerance threshold, and today that threshold had reached its breaking point. Marcus pulled a rubber coupling from his jacket pocket, quickly attaching it to the exposed shaft. His movements were fast, deliberate, as though each turn of the wrench was a precise heartbeat. Inside him, there was no room for emotions, no space for anger, no room for pain, and certainly no place for pride. Far away, Charlotte was still standing on the aircraft stairs, furious, anxious, and helpless. Three emotions that had never coexisted in her expression before. She was shouting into her phone, screaming at someone on the other end, "Call another chief engineer. Don't let that technician touch anything else. If this is discovered, the company's stock will crash." She wasn't looking at the landing gear. She wasn't asking about the cause. For Charlotte, the issue wasn't technical. It was about reputation. She was afraid the media would find out, afraid the investors would react, afraid the board of directors, and above all, afraid of her father, Richard Reynolds, the founder of Reynolds Corporation, finding out that she had let a maintenance issue slide, simply because she didn't like the mechanic who didn't look sophisticated enough. The urgent commands from Charlotte now became meaningless amidst the chaos, as Marcus, the very man she had just scorned and humiliated, was the only one keeping his head cool enough to solve the most serious technical issue of the day. As the plane was pulled away from the takeoff position, the landing gear tilted slightly as if it was about to snap. But thanks to the emergency reinforcement, it held firm. The hiss of compressed pressure filled the air. Moments later, the system stopped. People looked at each other. The explosion didn't happen, the accident didn't occur, but a silent earthquake had just been triggered. No one dared to speak it, but everyone understood. Marcus had saved them. When the fire department and senior engineers rushed in to inspect, Marcus stepped back, avoiding the circle of people. He didn't want to stand in the spotlight. But even as he tried to avoid it, the eyes of those who had once looked down on him followed each step he took, a silence that was no longer contempt, but shame. One of the department heads, Mr. Wallace, who had been a lead engineer at the airport for over 25 years, approached to inspect Marcus's work, then said after a few seconds of silence, "If it weren't for these temporary measures, we could have had a fatality, maybe the whole flight." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. In the distance, Charlotte stared at the scene before her. No one ran to report to her. No one sought her instructions. Every gaze had shifted toward the man she had once called unqualified, someone who had never stepped into a luxury jet. For the first time in her life, Charlotte didn't know what to do. And even more frightening, she didn't know what she was feeling. The familiar anger was still there, but this time, it wasn't arrogance, it was fear. Not fear of the consequences, but fear of the truth. The truth that perhaps she, and the world she represented, had judged this man horribly wrong. She bit her lip, lowered her head, gripping the stairs rail tightly as if clinging to the last vestiges of power left. Meanwhile, Marcus stepped back toward the shadow of the tech shelter. He didn't look back at her, not out of hatred, but because in his mind there was no room for the insults of the past. There was only one cold question ringing in his head. Why should someone like her be allowed to decide the fate of hundreds of people without taking any responsibility when everything falls apart? He didn't know, but he was sure of one thing. In that moment, he had done the right thing. Not for her, but for the others, the ones who didn't have a choice. Outside, the plane was safely in the hangar. The chief engineer was writing the preliminary report. The leak parameters were being recorded, and no one mentioned Marcus by name. But in their eyes, he was no longer invisible. He was the one who had stood in the eye of the storm and held firm the last bastion between engineering and disaster. The silver plane of Reynolds Corporation was slowly towed back into the hangar, drawing the gaze of many, not because of its luxurious appearance, but because of the chilling truth that had just been discovered. It had nearly become a mobile bomb in the sky. As the senior engineering team began to disassemble, inspect each assembly, and run pressure tests, the initial doubts quickly gave way to a solid conclusion. Without Marcus's emergency intervention, the plane would have met disaster just minutes after leaving the ground. The phrase, "It was almost a bomb," began to spread through hushed whispers across the hangar. Initially within the technical room, then to the administrative staff, and eventually even reaching the ears of senior management. But even as the story circulated, one thing didn't happen. No one came to thank Marcus Johnson. He stood quietly next to the auxiliary tech station, watching as the engineers, those who had once ignored him as though he were invisible, now bent their heads over every joint with unusual seriousness. Each one of them knew they had come closer to disaster than ever before, and escaped not by luck, but because of a man they had once dismissed as just a lowly mechanic. Marcus didn't expect applause. He didn't need a medal. But the silence surrounding him wasn't one of respect. It was the awkwardness of those confronting their own prejudices. That silence weighed heavier than any criticism he had ever received because it was avoidance, avoiding eye contact, avoiding the truth, avoiding the acknowledgement that they had been wrong, that they had disrespected the right person. A few people passed by him, pausing for a moment, as if they wanted to say something, but then continued walking, offering nothing more than a silent nod in place of thanks. A young engineer named Brian even stopped right in front of him for a few seconds. His eyes lost, then lowered his head so deeply that Marcus could no longer see his face. But instead of a simple thank you, Brian just pursed his lips, nodded slightly, and turned away. Marcus didn't blame them. He had long been accustomed to people accepting the truth, but lacking the courage to recognize the one who brought it to them. At the far end of the hangar, Charlotte Reynolds was still standing there, like a statue amidst the crowd that was beginning to disperse. Her phone was silent in her hand now. No more shouting, no more commanding. Only her wide eyes, filled with confusion and unease, as though a part of the world she had believed to be untouchable had just collapsed right in front of her. And what was more terrifying, she didn't know how to rebuild it. She hadn't said anything since the pilot had ignored her and ordered the plane to be pulled back. No one came to report to her. The employees who once waited for her glance before acting now avoided her, as if she had turned into something fragile, or no longer as intimidating as they once thought. Charlotte looked at Marcus. He was standing alone, not far from her, but his gaze no longer returned to hers. Not out of disdain, but because he had done his job, while she was still stuck in the consequences of her own arrogance. Suddenly, Charlotte furrowed her brow. There was something in Marcus's expression that made her hesitate. A vague memory surfaced, like a flash of lightning in the night. She saw the image of a woman, dark-skinned, deep eyes, and a calm voice, echoing somewhere in her old memories. Of course. Her mother had once told her about an accident years ago, when her father, Richard Reynolds, had nearly died in a fiery car crash on the outskirts of Georgia. A black woman had saved him from the flames. No payment, no questions asked, only leaving him with one line before she left. "I just did what was right." Charlotte shook her head as though wanting to banish the thought. She didn't want to believe that she had ever heard and forgotten that story. But Marcus's expression, his calm gaze, and those calloused hands full of quiet strength made her realize maybe she had seen that image before, not in real life, but in an old photograph. A feeling of unease crept into her chest. She looked around, and no one was standing by her side. No assistants, no allies. Everyone was turning away, not because of the technical failure, but because she had stripped herself of her legitimacy by disrespecting the one person who deserved it the most. After a few minutes of watching everyone return to their tasks, Marcus gently lifted the toolbox. He didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. He had done the right thing, and right things were rarely accompanied by comfort. As he turned and walked away, his shadow stretched long across the hangar floor, silent as the man himself. No one called him back, no one held him back. But in the hearts of all those who witnessed, the way he left, quietly, calmly, and with full composure, spoke one thing that no one dared to admit out loud, that on that day, the one they had once ignored had saved the sky from an indelible stain. As for Charlotte, she remained standing, watching his retreating figure. Her heart tightened with an emotion she had never named, a shame that money couldn't wash away, and an increasing doubt that the man wasn't just a mechanic. He was the continuation of something her family owed, and had never repaid. Charlotte stood motionless at the plane's stairway, her eyes following Marcus's figure as it disappeared behind the tugs and technical stands. The wind tugged at her vest, carrying the acrid smell of burning oil and rubber, the scent of chaos just extinguished. But for Charlotte, the biggest fire wasn't out there. It was smoldering within her. A fire with no smoke, only leaving behind doubt, which was slowly turning into fear. And elsewhere, just a few blocks away, a phone call was freezing time in a gleaming walnut-paneled office. On the top floor of Reynolds Corporation's headquarters, a shimmering glass building in the heart of Miami's financial district, Richard Reynolds was reviewing a report when his personal secretary, Lillian, knocked gently at the door. Her voice wasn't loud, but there was something in her expression that made Richard put his pen down. "Mr. Reynolds, there's been an incident at the VIP hangar. The Gulfstream G650, Miss Charlotte's plane, encountered a serious malfunction before takeoff." Richard looked up, his face still composed. For him, technical issues were common in such a vast corporation like Reynolds. But it was Lillian's next words that made him pause. "And the person who prevented the disaster is a technician named Marcus Johnson. Would you like to see the report?" Lillian didn't notice that when that name was spoken, Richard's hand on the desk flinched slightly. Just for a split second, but enough for his usually calm demeanor to shift. "Did you just say Marcus Johnson?" "Yes." According to the report from the engineering team at the scene, if he hadn't intervened in time, the plane could have exploded upon takeoff. Richard leaned back in his chair. The air conditioner still hummed. The room was quiet, but within him, a memory buried for 40 years began to surface, like an unstoppable flood. It happened in 1983 on a wet mountain road in the outskirts of Georgia. Richard, then just an arrogant young businessman with aspirations to reach the pinnacle of the aviation industry, was speeding his Porsche 911 around blind curves in the pouring rain. One hand on the wheel, the other holding a large phone from the era, he didn't notice the slick oil slick stretching across the curve. And then, the crash. The sound of glass shattering. The deafening screech of twisting metal under the force of gravity. The car flipped multiple times, rolling into the grass embankment, finally coming to rest beneath a pile of crumpled metal. Richard came to, hearing the hiss of an engine leaking oil, and flames had already started to lick at the front of the car. He couldn't move. The seatbelt had jammed, tight like a death grip. He gasped for breath, his vision clouding in the smoke. And then, from somewhere, a figure appeared. It was a woman. Dark skin, her hair loose and tangled, wearing a rain-soaked brown janitor's uniform. She didn't speak much, only looked at him with a resolute gaze. Despite the intense heat from the fire near his face, despite the sharp metal edges of the twisted car frame, she grabbed the door and pulled with all her strength. When the rescue team arrived, they found her holding Richard, sitting by the side of the road, the rain pouring down on them both. Her hands were blistered from the heat, her dress stained with mud and blood, but she didn't leave until he was placed on the stretcher. She only said one thing. "I just did what was right." She didn't leave a name, but Richard found it later through medical records. Marianne Johnson, a janitor at a roadside motel, a widow with a young son named Marcus. And now that same name, Marcus Johnson, echoed again under different circumstances. Once more, the life of his family was saved by the bloodline of the woman who had once risked her life for him. Without a moment's hesitation, Richard stood up. He grabbed the car keys left behind a meeting with 3 major investors and walked straight out of the office, leaving Lillian bewildered. He didn't say anything except 3 words. "I'm going to the hangar." As the gray Bentley rolled out of the building's garage, Richard didn't turn on the radio, didn't make any calls. He drove in silence, his hands still gripping the wheel. Fragments of memories mixed in his mind like a slow-motion film. Mary Ann's gaze, the screech of metal, those calloused hands pulling him from the edge of death. And now, a man, with those same eyes, those same hands, had just saved his daughter from a disaster. But what made him shudder wasn't the coincidence. It was the undeniable truth. His family owed theirs twice, and had never repaid it. When Richard walked into the VIP hangar without announcement, without ceremony, his presence froze the entire space. The technicians working raised their heads, and the managers immediately stood still. No one mistook him for anyone else. The neatly cut silver hair, the perfectly tailored gray suit, the deep green eyes, and the purposeful stride of a man who had built an empire from nothing. Charlotte was standing nearby, her eyes still fixed on the technical inspection report, but as soon as she saw her father, her face immediately changed. She rushed towards him, as if seeking shelter, but before she could speak he raised his hand, signaling for silence. He didn't look at her. His eyes scanned for someone else, and then he saw him. Marcus was standing near the auxiliary power station, his back turned, still unaware of anyone approaching. When Richard turned around, their eyes met. The same eyes that had once pulled Richard from death, now present in the eyes of the son. In that moment, without confirmation, without checking paperwork, Richard knew, his heart clenched. Not from guilt, but from a rare feeling he had always avoided, gratitude and shame, all at once. Charlotte looked at her father, then at Marcus. Her eyes flicked quickly between the two, an uneasy premonition swelling in her chest. She didn't understand what was happening, but her father's expression was unlike any she had seen before. And deep inside, a small voice whispered, "What have I done to this man?" She didn't know, but she was about to face that answer not with words, but with the historical truth of her own family. Richard stood still, his gaze fixed firmly on Marcus as though he were looking through both the past and the present. The vast hangar fell into an unusual silence, as if no one dared to break the moment when the history of an empire collided head-on with something it had always avoided, an unpaid moral debt. Charlotte stood silently beside him, her hands clasped together, her eyes flicking between her father and Marcus. Inside her, a storm of emotions had been stirred. Confusion, unease, and shame. She had never seen her father like this. He was always calm, almost cold, never revealing emotion, never swayed by anyone. Yet here he was, looking at a mechanic as if he had just recognized a part of himself. The air grew thick when Richard spoke, his voice slow and deep but resonant. "Did you humiliate this man?" That question, which seemed like a simple verification, created an underlying tension that echoed through the entire space. Everyone present, from technicians to senior managers, turned their gaze to Charlotte. They all knew the answer, but every eye waited to see what she would say. Charlotte lowered her head, her shoulders shrinking as if frozen in front of the sun. She mumbled, I didn't know who he was." Richard's eyes remained locked on her. His voice, now cold enough to make her words seem less like a question and more like an indictment. "So, if you had known who he was, would you have shown him more respect? Or is respect to you only reserved for those with titles, fame, or social standing?" That question pierced not just Charlotte, but everyone around them, those who had once looked down on Marcus, who had ignored him as though he were just another part of the machinery among the countless machines in the hangar. Charlotte remained silent. She couldn't answer. She knew that any excuse would only make things worse. She had disrespected Marcus, not because of his skills, but because he didn't fit the power framework she was taught to value. A long silence enveloped them. Then Richard turned around to face everyone. His voice was firm, clear, leaving no room for retreat. I, as the founder and chairman of Reynolds Corporation, hereby announce Charlotte Reynolds will be temporarily relieved of all executive positions within the corporation until further notice. A small wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Whispers, stunned gazes. No one expected him to do this, to relieve his own daughter of her duties. But Richard's voice did not waver. He continued. And I formally invite Marcus Johnson, the man who just saved my daughter, the man this corporation once ignored, to take the role of CEO of the Reynolds Community Training Project. From now on, he will have full authority to build, implement, and oversee vocational training programs for underprivileged youth, even if that means completely overturning the current personnel model. This time, there were no more whispers, no more confusion, only absolute silence, the kind that only arises when an entire system faces an undeniable truth. Charlotte was shaken. She turned quickly to her father, her eyes wide, her mouth moving as if about to react. But Richard merely tilted his head toward her, his gaze hardening. Be silent, Charlotte. This is no longer a family matter. This is a matter of ethics. A lesson you need to learn. Not from textbooks on management, but from life itself. Charlotte felt as if the world around her was crumbling. Everything she had ever believed, that with the Reynolds name she was untouchable, was now being shattered by her own father's words in just a few sentences. She turned to look at Marcus, the man she had mocked, humiliated, and outright rejected less than an hour ago, just because he didn't fit her image of a professional. Now he was the one given real power, not by lineage, but by ability and righteousness. Marcus stood still, as if nailed to the spot. Richard's words struck him like stones. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he understood the price he had just paid to receive this acknowledgement. And it wasn't just for him, but for all the people who had been overlooked, underestimated or ridiculed simply because they didn't have the right name, the right skin color, or the shiny uniform. Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't show any signs of victory. There was no need. His eyes were no longer directed at Charlotte, nor at the executives who bowed their heads. His gaze was on the future, on people like him in the past, waiting for a door to be opened. Richard moved closer and extended his hand toward Marcus. A handshake, for the first time, between a man who had once been saved by his mother and a man now carrying that legacy forward to save others. Marcus shook his hand, neither deferential nor overly enthusiastic, just with the proper respect between two individuals who understood each other's value. And in that deep, meaningful gaze, both of them understood that there were some debts that couldn't be repaid with money, but could only be repaid through acts of fairness, the transfer of real power, and by breaking down barriers that had stood for too long in a world defined by privilege. Marcus's hand still lightly gripped Richard's as he gave a small nod. It wasn't a nod of victory, but a nod of someone accepting a responsibility greater than themselves. Before him stood no longer Richard Reynolds, the chairman of the board, the billionaire who had once appeared in every prestigious ranking, but a father who had seen his own mistakes through the silent eyes of his daughter, and now was trying to amend them with concrete actions, not empty apologies. Marcus released the handshake and looked around the hangar, a place that just hours ago had been a domain of power and privilege, but now was crowded with curious, confused, embarrassed, and sometimes even admiring gazes. He knew that by accepting this role, everything would change, not just for him, but for everyone like him out there. People born in places where the airport lights are just a distant glimmer, but with hearts burning with the desire to soar, even though their feet are bound by injustice and poverty. Marcus didn't take long to make his decision, but he didn't accept the position easily either. "I agree, Mr. Reynolds," Marcus said, his voice clear, his eyes not once looking down, "but with one condition. This project cannot become a PR tool or a fame-building program for the company. It has to be for the forgotten communities, just like the one I grew up in. The neighborhoods where people say, 'Don't dream too big,' where the kid who dreams of being an aerospace engineer is laughed at. If we do this, it has to be real. It has to reach the people who've never had the chance to step in here." Richard paused for a beat, then nodded. Not a polite nod, but a nod from someone who understood the true value of words more than any contract he had ever signed. The next day, Marcus walked into a small tech room beside the main operations building, a space once used only to store old documents, now turned into the starting office for a project never before seen in Reynolds Corporation's history. No nameplate on the door, no plush leather chairs, just a worn wooden desk, an even older computer, a stack of blank paper, and a dream that was finally allowed to begin. The first knock came from Ethan Carter, the only colleague who had ever treated Marcus like a human, not a replaceable part that could be forgotten. Ethan didn't say much. He simply placed a box of coffee on the table and sat across from Marcus. "I heard," he said, raising an eyebrow, his tired but genuine smile showing. "How are you going to start?" Marcus opened his notebook, flipping through a few pages of hasty scrawlings from the night before, when he hadn't slept, not from fear, but because his mind couldn't stop thinking about the forgotten kids, the Marcuses of the past, who needed a place to dream and to learn. "We're starting the first course right here," Marcus said. 3 months basic aircraft maintenance training. A small group, but we have to choose carefully. Pick the ones who've never been believed to be capable. Ethan nodded quietly. They began outlining the plan, curriculum, hands-on training, safety gear, supplies. Each line written down was a commitment. There was no startup budget, no big backing, just the promise from Richard and their own backs. Marcus and Ethan began reaching out to public high schools in the surrounding suburbs, places with high dropout rates and even higher juvenile crime rates. They went to community councils, spoke with parents, sharing the project not as representatives of Reynolds Corporation, but as people who had stepped out of those very neighborhoods, knowing what it needed to change. The project, initially called simply LIFT, quickly gained attention from a small group of students and parents. Not because the program was flashy, but because it was real. Students got direct access to machinery. No empty theories, no academic lectures, just reality, and the belief that if they took learning seriously, they could one day stand on that runway, not to mop floors, but to inspect cockpits. Marcus set up 3 non-negotiable principles. Completely free, no tuition, no uniform fees. The project ran on grants and trust. No discrimination based on past academic performance, whether their GPA was low or they had a history of discipline problems. If they were willing to learn, they were in. Learning through practice. Every theoretical lesson came with a shift in the hangar, under supervision. But then, something Marcus hadn't expected began to happen. As the news about the project spread, some senior managers within the company, particularly those who had been close to Charlotte, began to express subtle opposition. They didn't speak out publicly, but equipment approval emails were delayed. Requests to use training areas were returned with no clear reason. Some started whispering that the project was a legal risk, inconsistent with the company's image. And from there, Marcus began to feel something he knew all too well: the silent resistance from those with privilege. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ethan walked in one morning throwing a document down on the table, a notice of rejection for a supplies purchase request. "They don't want us to exist, Marcus. To them, those poor kids are just a stain on the Reynolds marble floor." Marcus only smiled faintly, his gaze unshaken. "Then we'll work on concrete. Dusty, but real." He didn't know, and perhaps didn't care, that at the same time, from the executive offices, Charlotte Reynolds was watching every step he took, not through power, but through something far more uncomfortable: the realization that the man she had once disrespected was doing something she had never thought of, and succeeding. Although Marcus didn't speak it out loud, he knew. Every step forward of the lift project was like a thorn in the eyes of those who had once regarded him as invisible. And when an invisible man starts to be seen, when a voice that was once mocked now has the authority to make decisions, the first reaction of those who are accustomed to being on top is never silence. From the makeshift office next to the main operations building, Marcus and Ethan watched as the number of sign-ups increased week by week. The kids from neighborhoods that the media had once labeled as unstable began wearing helmets, learning to disassemble engines, standing in the hangar listening to instruction from technicians who had once only been tasked with cleaning cockpits. A new world was taking shape, a world where capability was no longer measured by home address or skin color, but by the quality of each bolt tightened. But at the same time, an old world began to push back, silently, subtly, but with intention. It started with small things: purchase requests for equipment being denied, vague reasons like unclear budget or not the right cycle. Then came changes to the training hangar schedule at the last minute, forcing the hands-on classes to be indefinitely postponed. Ethan, frustrated, had knocked on the door of the technical management office, demanding an explanation, but was met with only shrugged shoulders and responses like "don't know," "ask upper management," and "waiting for instructions." Marcus didn't need to ask anyone to know whose hands were pulling the strings. Charlotte Reynolds may no longer hold an executive position, but that didn't mean her influence had disappeared entirely. Those who had once been loyal to her, deputy directors, department heads who had benefited from their connections to the Reynolds family, were still around. They didn't confront Marcus openly, but in closed meetings over quiet lunches, they began to sow the seeds of dissent. What do those poor kids know about aerospace engineering? Do they have the math to do this kind of work? We're setting a dangerous precedent. Letting them in here will lead to all sorts of trouble. This project is just embarrassing the company. Look at how those kids dress. The way they said "them," without clarifying who exactly, was enough to know where their loyalties lay. No one dared to openly challenge Marcus. But every hallway, every desk, every lost request form, it was all a battle fought without gunfire, but every shot aimed straight at the heart of the lift project. Ethan, more hot-headed than Marcus, had slammed his fist on the table in meetings. If you don't want this project to exist, at least have the guts to say it openly. But what choked him was the calmness of those sitting across from him. They only smiled, sipped their coffee, made notes, as if he were performing a play whose script they had memorized long ago. One afternoon, Marcus received an anonymous email, no subject line, no introduction, just an attached audio file. He opened it, the light hum of background noise, then the voice of someone he recognized immediately. Trent Whitmore, the deputy director of HR, once Charlotte's right-hand man. Let Marcus play his charity game for a few more weeks. Then those kids will back out on their own. If anyone doesn't leave, we'll find a reason to fire them. This airport can't become a training ground for the uneducated." Marcos sat still. He didn't feel anger. He only felt something colder than contempt. It was indifference, the kind of indifference shown when someone decides to extinguish the future of children without hesitation, as if they weren't human beings but just a stack of files to be discarded with a few keystrokes. He transferred the audio file to his personal computer, saved it. He didn't send it out. He didn't threaten anyone. He knew that in this battle, exposing the truth publicly was the final step. Before that, he needed to prove it through action. And then, the sabotage escalated beyond paperwork. One Monday morning, Marcus and Ethan arrived at the hangar as usual, only to freeze in place at the sight of devastation. The training room had been trashed. Equipment was torn apart, cables cut, oil spilled across the floor. On the wall, in bright red paint, a hastily written message read, "Not meant to be here." No cameras had been working the night before. No security guard had seen anything unusual. No alarms, no noise. Only the silence, the familiar kind of silence from systems that know how to protect the old, even when the old is rotting. Ethan stood motionless for a few seconds, then turned to Marcus, his voice low but filled with fury. "This is a declaration of war." Marcus didn't say anything. He just walked slowly toward the broken training table, sat down amidst the wreckage, picking up a broken piece of equipment casing. In the palm of his calloused hand, he felt the sharp edges, like feeling the attitude of the entire system pushing him back into the darkness. "Not meant to be here." He repeated the words on the wall, nodding slightly. "Then we'll start again. Right here. Right on the very floor they wanted to kick us out of." He didn't need to wait for a miracle. He had will, and a team ready to stand together in the rubble to rebuild from the ground up. That afternoon, Marcus sent a message to every student in the lift project. "We won't stop. If you still want to learn, come here tomorrow morning. Bring your hands ready to work, and hearts that aren't easily broken." No flowery words, no promises. Just an invitation to continue. On a journey that wasn't welcomed but was deserving. And in a corner of the senior management office corridor, Charlotte Reynolds stood before the glass window, looking down at the hangar from the 6th floor, silently. The project she had once mocked, once disrespected, was now being sabotaged step by step by the very people she knew well. But when she saw Marcus standing amidst the broken equipment, his gaze still calm, Charlotte didn't know what in her heart had begun to shift, something that even she wasn't yet ready to name. The rough, red-painted words were still clearly visible on the wall, like a wound that hadn't yet dried. "Not meant to be here." Marcus stood before it, his eyes unwavering, his hand hanging loosely at his side, his calloused mechanic's hand now clenched as if to hold steady. The destruction wasn't just about material damage, it was a statement, a warning, an unofficial expulsion from those who hid behind power but were no less ruthless. The practice room, once the heart of the lift project, where poor youth first touched real engine models, was now a wasteland. Desks overturned, computer screens smashed, frayed wires hanging like cuts between belief and reality. Oil stains spread across the floor, forming dark, slick pools that reflected Marcus and Ethan quietly surveying the scene. But if Ethan was angry enough to nearly kick over the remaining toolbox, Marcus remained eerily calm. He bent down, picked up a broken wrench, and exhaled slowly. "They want us to react the way they expect," Marcus said. "Angry, yelling, giving up, or slipping into violence. So they can have an excuse to end it all, but they forgot one thing. Ethan looked at him, still clenching his fists. Forgot what? Marcus looked up, his eyes fixed on the red words now drying on the wall. That we've been broken before, but we stood up, and this time we'll stand up right here, where we were knocked down. Not waiting for approval, not waiting for apologies. Marcus and Ethan started cleaning up from that very morning. Each broken chair was pulled outside. Wires were temporarily patched with tubing, smashed screens taken down. The desk wiped down with old rags to clean the oil stains. Every action was a quiet but powerful resistance, resisting prejudice, stigma, and a system accustomed to pushing people like Marcus aside. Ethan brought some personal tools from home. Marcus called contacts from local car repair shops for help. At first, it was just some old welding rods, leftover copper wire, and a few broken pieces of plexiglass to shield the wind. But then, like a wind blowing through, everything started to change. That afternoon, as they were busy restoring the primary electrical lines, 3 teenagers showed up at the door. No knock, no warning. Just standing there, wearing old shirts, sunburned hair, scratched hands. One of them, a boy named Darnell, had once been called by his teacher, someone who would never pay attention long enough to learn anything. "We heard the news. They wrecked it, huh?" Darnell asked, not surprised, just sad. "Yeah," Marcus answered, not stopping his work. "Need help?" Ethan looked up, frowning as if about to decline, but Marcus nodded. "If you're ready to work, not just stand and watch, then come in." That evening, the group didn't leave until after 10 p.m. The boys, once labeled incapable, learned to change fuses, weld temporary electrical connections, and categorize tools by their technical codes. No more theories on paper, no more report cards, just reality and dirty hands ready to learn. The next day, 6 showed up, then 9, then 12. News spread quickly through the suburban community. A project once disregarded had now become the place where forgotten kids found real value. No interviews required, no 2-page application. Just showing up and being ready. But this rebirth didn't bring joy to everyone. In the senior executive offices, Trent Whitmore, the HR deputy director, who had once said, "Those uneducated kids will give up soon enough," sat facing his computer screen listening to a report from a subordinate. They fix it all? Yes, and they've started a new class. The community is fundraising for them. "Too dangerous," Trent mumbled. "It's starting to become a movement." He clenched his jaw. For people like Trent, the existence of the Lift project wasn't just a challenge to power. It was a threat to the very order they had maintained for years. The idea that truly capable people should look like them, speak like them, be born where they were born. And Marcus, someone who didn't belong to that framework, was breaking all their premises. A week after the sabotage, when everything had been nearly restored, Marcus stood before the group of students. No lecture, no microphone, just him and a whiteboard with one large word written, "Why we don't give up." They say we don't belong here, but I'm telling you, we are making this place. With our own hands, with our will, with every morning we get up earlier than the others. Not to prove anything to them, but to prove to ourselves that we deserve to learn, to work, and to be trusted. The hangar was silent. No one hung their heads, no one sighed. Only eyes that sparkled like lights finally turned on in a darkness that had lasted too long. Ethan walked over, gently tapping Marcus on the shoulder. "You know, those kids, they don't need the program anymore. They've got faith. The rest is just time." Marcus smiled, not out of self-satisfaction, but because he knew Ethan was right. The saboteurs had left a message on the wall, but it was the actions of these kids that were the real answer. Not meant to be here? Then we'll change this place so it's worthy of us. Marcus's response rang out like a brief declaration. Then we'll change this place so it deserves us. Before the words had even cooled, darkness crept in again, not with hammers or red paint this time, but with paperwork, evaluation sheets, and the stamp of authority. Less than a week after the sabotage, Reynolds Corporation's Senior Management Board suddenly issued a notice for a comprehensive inspection of the lift project. The reason cited in the document: to ensure safety standards and quality of training. But for Marcus, Ethan, and anyone who had ever clashed with this system, they all knew. This was not a routine inspection. This was a disguised execution. 8 a.m. The sky was grayer than usual, as if the weather itself understood that today wasn't just another inspection. Luxury cars with the company logo rolled up in front of the main operations building. Board members stepped out, leather briefcases in hand, shirts impeccably pressed, faces like molds. No smiles, no handshakes, just cold eyes and clipboards. In a small courtyard far off, Charlotte Reynolds stood behind the third-floor glass, silently watching. She was no longer an executive, nor the decision-maker in today's inspection, but something in her gaze was changing. A silence that no longer fully aligned with the side she had once stood on. Ethan walked over to Marcus. They were standing in the newly restored training area. The students stood in a line behind them, gloves on, uniform slightly worn, but eyes bright with anticipation. "Are we ready?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "We don't need to be ready for them," Marcus replied. "We just need to live up to what they never believed in." The inspection proceeded in an atmosphere heavy with tension. They checked every model, every wire. One inspector leaned down to examine a small connection, smirking. "This wire doesn't meet Type 3 insulation standards." Another flipped through a notebook. "There's no camera recording the training process." Yet another stood in front of the class, asking Darnell, the student once deemed incapable of learning technical skills, a question about the pressure ratio in a hydraulic system. Darnell's response wasn't smooth. He hesitated for a few seconds before offering a close enough answer. The man jotted it down without looking up. They didn't ask who had taught Darnell. They didn't ask if he had been exposed to this knowledge before. They simply wrote down a number. Answer incorrect. Each inspector acted like a silent judge, taking notes as if the verdict had already been decided. They didn't check how much the students had learned. They checked how many technical errors could be found to justify eliminating the project. When the inspection concluded, the board representative, a man named Milton Kautz, wearing a light gray suit, rimless glasses, stood at the front of the class and spoke in a voice that didn't need to be raised. "We've completed the inspection. The results will be presented within 24 hours. But I can say right away, there are too many discrepancies in equipment standards, evaluation processes, data storage, and proof of student competency. With this condition, the lift project fails to meet Reynolds Corporation's internal operational standards. Therefore, the suspension of all activities is necessary." A wave of silence washed over the room. The students' eyes dropped. A few quietly tightened their gloves. Ethan started to step forward, but Marcus raised his hand to stop him. He walked straight into the middle of the room, facing Milton, in front of everyone, and even under the watchful eyes from the third floor. Marcus wasn't angry, but his gaze was so clear that Milton hesitated for half a second. "I won't argue with your checklist," Marcus said, his voice clear but not raised, "because I know this checklist wasn't created to assess safety. It was created to eliminate what you cannot control." Milton started to speak, but Marcus took a step closer. "And I'll say it plainly. You can terminate the project. You can fire me. You can turn everything here into a storage office. But there's one thing you cannot do. Deny the truth that these kids have learned more than any program you've ever put together." He turned to look at the class, the young faces, once mocked as hopeless, now silently looking up. "You've learned how to take apart an engine, but more importantly, you've learned how to believe that you deserve knowledge, even if today's test tried to prove the opposite." A moment of silence, then a sudden round of applause. Not from the students, not from Ethan, but from a corner of the hallway, where Richard Reynolds had just appeared, briefcase in hand, eyes locked on Milton Keats. "I don't need to wait 24 hours, Richard said, his voice steady, each word as sharp as steel. "I've watched the entire inspection through the monitoring system, and I've also read the technical files of this project from the start. Not a single line demands the pilot program to adhere to research lab standards. Yet, you've applied those standards to draw a flawed conclusion." He stared directly at Milton. "If this is how the board evaluates life-changing initiatives, then I'm afraid we need to reconsider the board itself." Milton stepped back. The others quickly lowered their heads, taking notes. Richard turned to Marcus, giving him a slight nod. "This program will continue, and from today it will be under the direct patronage of the chairman of the corporation. No one has the authority to suspend it except me." On the third floor, Charlotte still stood behind the glass. For the first time in her life, she saw her father stand with someone else. Not because of shared status, not because of shared financial ideals, but because of what was right. And what bothered her even more was knowing that Marcus had earned this by the very values she had once mocked. The first round of applause from Richard Reynolds spread like a spark catching on dry wood. Within seconds, the entire workshop reverberated with a simultaneous round of clapping, not from the management or those with titles, but from those who had once been forgotten, once considered invisible. The warehouse workers, the downstairs technicians, students from poor neighborhoods, and even the janitors who had quietly walked the halls for years. Marcus stood at the epicenter of it all, not lifting his head in pride, nor moved to tears. He simply looked around and understood. This was no longer a project. This was a declaration that legitimacy isn't born from titles but from what we dare to do, even when the whole system says otherwise. On the third floor, Charlotte Reynolds stood behind the two-way glass. From her vantage point, she saw everything, from the way the students clapped with hands covered in grease, to the expression on her father's face, who had just delivered a direct blow to those who had been loyal to him for 2 decades. She didn't say anything, but her hand, gripping the glass door, said it all. Today's failure didn't come from the system, it came from her. No one forced her to apologize. But the silence from her father, and from all those who turned away, was heavier than any punishment. 3 days later, an emergency board of directors meeting was called. Not by the executive committee's proposal, but by Richard himself. For the first time in many years, he didn't delegate to any vice chairman, but directly presided over the meeting, in the highest shareholder meeting room of Reynolds Corporation. Marcus was invited, not as an employee, no longer as technician Marcus Johnson, but as the man who had stood up in the storm and didn't get swept away. The room was brightly lit with mahogany walls and a soft golden chandelier, now eerily tense. The board members, who once wore identical suits like playing cards facing up, stared at Marcus as if still trying to understand how this man could have come this far without a proper lineage. Richard opened the meeting with a short sentence. "Today, we won't discuss finances. We will discuss the future." Then he turned to Marcus. I only have one question for you, a question that will decide the entire direction of this company for the next decade. The air in the room grew heavy. Marcus Johnson, I want to know what you choose. A seat on the board of directors, with all the power, salary, and privileges, where you can control more, protect yourself, and make decisions from the top. Or you can refuse it all and keep the leadership of the community training program, continue working in the lower levels, between machinery and workers, but with no decision-making power, no guarantees for yourself. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, where every wall seemed to exude the coldness of power frozen in place. Then he remembered. Every kid wiping sweat from their sleeves. Every young person looking up at a plane for the first time with bright eyes. And he remembered his mother, Mary Ann Johnson, who once said, "Not everyone who stands at the top is a leader. Sometimes the leader is the one who dares to bend down and lift others up." Marcus looked up, speaking slowly. "I choose the second path. Not because I'm not capable of the first, but because I know where I need to stand to not betray the ideal that brought me here." The room fell silent. A few board members leaned back in their chairs, their faces contorted in disbelief that he had rejected power. One person even surreptitiously flipped through Marcus's personal records, as if looking for a flaw. But Richard smiled, a rare smile, slightly sad but sincere. "Then, because you've rejected personal power, I will give you collective power." He turned to the board. "I propose that, from now on, the LIFT project will no longer be a subsidiary project. It will become one of the 3 core activities of Reynolds Corporation, with its own budget, legal framework, and protected by the same regulations as the Strategic R&D Department." A small shockwave spread across the table. But Richard didn't let anyone interrupt. "Our company exists not just to operate planes, but to build a generation capable of fixing the system we leave behind. Without that, every Gulfstream we produce is hollow." After a minute of silence, the board, though not entirely in agreement, was forced to approve the resolution with the majority vote. Not because they liked Marcus, but because of the pressure from public opinion, internal staff, and personal consciences they could no longer hide. That afternoon, Marcus returned to the old hangar. The students rushed out, thinking he brought bad news. But when he raised the decision paper, printed with the Reynolds logo and the words Core Training Unit Lift Initiative, the entire maintenance area erupted with joy. Ethan ran over, whispering, "Did you take the seat on the board?" Marcus shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, I chose to stay, right where we started." In the corner of the yard, under the evening sun, someone stood silently. Charlotte. Not stepping forward, not turning away, but her gaze, for the first time, wasn't one of looking down. It was the gaze of someone beginning to learn from the beginning. That afternoon, at Miami International Airport, an extraordinary meeting was called. Not in the high-rise conference room, but right in the very hangar where the lift project had been destroyed, the place once deemed not meant to be here. Nearly 300 employees from all levels were present, from technicians, maintenance staff, and ground crew to mid-level managers and representatives from the board of directors. There was no grand stage, just a makeshift wooden platform, a simple microphone, and faces full of anticipation. At the center, Richard Reynolds stepped forward. The man once seen as the wall of power within the corporation was no longer wearing a dark suit or speaking in grandiose terms. He wore a white shirt with sleeves rolled up, his deep eyes locked directly on the crowd. No speech, no promises for the future. He spoke with the transparency the company had lacked for so many years. "I once believed that running a corporation was about keeping the wheels turning, growing profits, and stabilizing stocks. But I was wrong. Without people willing to step forward and fix mistakes through action, everything we've built is hollow. And so, I have an important announcement. The hangar seemed to hold its breath. Richard turned to his left where Charlotte stood. She wore a black coat, her expression stern, but her eyes seemed lost. It seemed as though she knew what was coming. But she didn't step back. She had chosen to stay and face it, instead of hiding in the boardroom as she once did. Charlotte Reynolds, from today, you will no longer hold any executive position in the company. All privileges, car services, allowances, office space and personal assistance will be revoked. Instead, you will start again, under the direct guidance of Marcus Johnson, not as punishment but to learn from the beginning, about humility, about dignity, about humanity. The words cut through the thick armor of prestige Charlotte had once worn like a suit of armor. Whispers spread like ripples across the room. Some people lowered their heads, some widened their eyes in disbelief that the sole heir had been publicly dethroned and handed over to the very person she had once mocked. All eyes turned to Charlotte. Her face went pale, her jaw slightly trembling. But then, tears quietly fell, without fanfare, without sobs. She didn't deny it, didn't place blame. She simply stepped up to the microphone, mustered all her courage, and said in a choked voice, "I was wrong." No one clapped, but no one turned away either. The silence was no longer judgment, it was recognition. Marcus stood still, not reveling in triumph, not looking at Charlotte with vengeful eyes. He understood. For someone like her, admitting a mistake in public wasn't humiliation. It was the beginning of a process of atonement. He walked over, standing next to her, offering no shoulder pat, no extended hand. He simply spoke, softly but firmly, "Welcome to where we started, from nothing, from the truth, and from action." From that day on, Charlotte began working like any other new employee in the training area. No more car service, no one opening doors for her. She wore gloves wiped off oil, checked pressure just like any student. Those who had once feared her now quietly watched her struggle, clumsy, awkward, but unwilling to quit. And then, day by day, she no longer became the fallen Miss Reynolds, but a true learner. Once, when Darnell, the student she had once ignored at the first seminar, helped her fix a misaligned pipe, she looked up, sweat beading on her forehead, and quietly said, "Thank you. You're really good at this." Darnell smiled, saying nothing, but his gaze had changed. He had forgiven her, not through words, but by giving her a chance just as Marcus had once been given. In another development, Marcus, now recognized as the leader of one of the 3 pillars of the corporation, didn't move his office upstairs. He remained at the technical station, still sitting amid the hum of machines and the scent of burning metal. But now, every time he walked through the hallways, those who had once ignored him, who had called him the wrench turner, stood up straight and nodded in respect. Not because of his title, but because he deserved it. Richard, though no longer young, still visited the hangar once a week to observe the classes. He didn't intervene. He simply watched, smiled, and often repeated to his colleagues, "I once thought the heir had to carry the Reynolds name. Now I know the one who deserves to inherit is the one who creates new value, not the one who clings to the old." And amidst all this, a silent but profound change took place. From within the closed system, a crack appeared. From that crack, light began to shine. Charlotte was no longer a shadow of privilege. Marcus was no longer a shadow of prejudice. Both of them, standing at opposite ends of the battlefield, now joined hands to rebuild something that Reynolds Corporation had never had before. a culture of fairness, starting from the lowest point, but with the power to reach the highest. That late afternoon, as the sunset bathed the modest streets of South Miami in golden light, Marcus Johnson returned to his small home. The wooden door creaked open with the old lock, the floorboards still slightly warped at the hallway corner, and the scent of aged wood and brewing coffee still blended together like a familiar song from his childhood. He placed his bag down, removed his gloves still stained with a bit of engine grease, and then, like a quiet ritual that never changes, he walked to the small wooden shelf in the living room, where the old time-worn photograph of the woman Marcus had called with all his gratitude and admiration, Mary Ann Johnson, his mother, sat. In the dark wooden frame, his mother was smiling, wearing her janitor uniform, holding a bucket of water, her eyes full of life despite the weariness in her gaze. It wasn't the smile of someone who had been honored. It was the smile of someone who had never needed recognition to do what was right. Marcus looked at the photo, silent. Today, he had stood before hundreds and rejected personal power, choosing to uphold collective ideals, and he understood it was not the first act of courage in his family. 40 years ago, his mother had saved a man trapped in a burning car, never seeking glory or reward. She only left one line, "I just did what was right." Today, when Richard Reynolds publicly declared that the lift project would become a core activity of the corporation, and when Charlotte, once a symbol of privilege, bowed her head to become a student of those she had once looked down upon, Marcus understood. The seed his mother had quietly planted all those years ago, in the shadows and in silence, had finally sprouted. From a small storage shed next to the hangar, Lyft now had its own facility. A training center with standard practice rooms, a theory section, a simulated technical area, and, most importantly, a scholarship fund created by the very workers who had once been seen as nothing more than tools. No funding from PR, no sponsors with logos everywhere. Everything was built by hands once thought crude, but now creating. The number of students grew month by month. There were boys from the slums who had never entered a library, girls who had been forced to drop out to care for siblings, now wearing technical uniforms, standing before electronic boards, teaching the next generation. Trust spread from person to person, not through theory, but through proof. Marcus no longer needed to speak about fairness. Fairness was being lived every day in the sound of drills, the hum of industrial wheels, the lectures from young engineers who had once been students of this very project. Ethan, now the deputy director of expertise at Lyft, still often walked past Marcus's office every morning, holding a hot coffee, giving his friend a light tap on the shoulder. We weren't wrong, starting from the rubble. Marcus just smiled, nodding. He understood. What they were building wasn't a training program. It was a new model of trust. A trust that those once forgotten could shape the future. And then, a small but significant event occurred. One of Lyft's first students, a boy named Luis, who could hardly speak a full sentence when he first started, had now been accepted into the Civil Aviation Academy with a full scholarship. During the farewell ceremony, when asked what he would do next, Luis only said, "I'll come back here and teach those who were like me." Because Lyft didn't just teach me how to turn bolts. It taught me how not to give up on myself. On the western runway, where Charlotte had once humiliated Marcus, where Lyft's classes were once rejected as not safe enough, it had now been renovated into the Future Technician Training Runway Mary Ann Johnson. No gilded plaques, no grand ceremonies, just a small wooden sign, hand-carved, placed between two neat grass plots with the inscription, "Here. Dreams take flight not by privilege, but by dignity and courage." The day the sign was erected, Richard personally came to place a bouquet of wildflowers. He didn't make a speech, he simply bowed his head, for a long time. That evening, Marcus sat alone on the porch, a cold cup of coffee in front of him and a sky full of stars. He looked up and remembered the last words his mother had said to him before she passed. "It doesn't matter how they look at you, Marcus. What matters is that you have the strength to look back and not blink." He looked up at the sky, smiled, and softly repeated, "I won't blink, Mom. I've looked straight ahead, and I will continue to lead the way." And so, on the ground of discrimination, hurt, and prejudice, the seed Mary Ann had planted with her burned hands all those years ago had grown into a forest of change. No need for proclamations, no need for revenge, just one person daring not to bow down, and a community daring to believe that fairness is not a distant dream. The story you just followed is a journey of quiet justice, of seeds of courage sown by an unknown person, and one day growing into a path for those once forgotten. Marcus Johnson did not become a symbol. He became a guide. If this story has touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next inspiring stories. Thank you for listening.